Good afternoon and good morning for those of you joining us from the West Coast. Welcome to Beyond the MSRP, or Looking Beyond the MSRP. My name is Marcus Gilmore. I am delighted to moderate today's panel on this topic. Joining me, as you see on the screen, are Turia Maycomer from Grid Alternatives, Suma Pesapati, and Vanessa Moreland. So I will allow each of our participants to introduce themselves, but just to give you a brief overview, even as the cost of electric vehicles decreases, new and used EVs remain out of the price range for many families and individuals nationwide. Robust secondary EV markets and sound incentive structures play a critical role in ensuring accessibility to electric transportation for all communities, especially those who are most adversely affected by transportation emissions. This panel will explore strategies to expand used EV access and adoption. So without further ado, I would like to turn over to each of our panelists to introduce themselves. So should we start with Suma?
Sure, thanks, Marcus. As Marcus mentioned, my name is Suma Pesapati. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Just a brief background on me. I am the inaugural Environmental Justice and Community Engagement Officer for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. I have the great privilege of working for Veronica Eady, who, as you all may know, is an icon in the environmental justice movement, a national icon. I started in this role about just over 2 months ago now. Time is flying. But before that, immediately before this job, I was a gubernatorial appointee with Cali, PA. I was Assistant General Counsel for Enforcement at Cali, PA. And before that, spent, I want to say 18, 20 years as an environmental litigator focused on air quality and environmental justice. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, Suma. All right, should we go, Turia?
Sure. Good morning. Turia Macomber. I use she, her pronouns. I am a project director for the California Air Resources Board. Forgot this is a national conference. California Air Resources Board's project Access Clean California. And I work at Grid Alternatives, which is one of the nation's largest solar nonprofits. And we've just expanded in the last few years into working in all the other interdependent technologies, including clean mobility. And I'll pass it to Vanessa.
Thank you so much. So I'm Vanessa Moreland. Pronouns are she and her. States manager at EV and we are one of the 2 organizations coordinating and hosting this conference. So thank you so much for all the participation and all the participants tuning in today. As a Western States program manager, I lead multimodal electric mobility advancements through e-mobility best practices, as well as e-mobility, diversity, equity, and inclusion. My work includes a lot of research, engagement, outreach, education, advocacy, as well as consulting, and a lot of things in between those spaces. Since graduating from UC Davis, roles in energy and transportation. So prior to my work at EV I actually was also at Grid Alternatives with Turia supporting a program called Clean Cars for All, which is also supported by BACMID. So a lot of overlap here in this space. Extremely excited to be here in partnership with these 2 and discussing the topic. So thank you.
All right, thank you for those wonderful introductions. And for those of you who missed us at the very top of today's panel, my name is Marcus Gilmore. I currently serve as a director of U.S. Transportation Programs for Center for Sustainable Energy. In this role, this is definitely a topic that is near and dear to my heart, since a large part of my job involves providing strategic direction and guidance to state and utility clients in designing incentive programs to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles as well as charging infrastructure. So we have experience working in a variety of markets from the East Coast to the West Coast, including New York, New Jersey, Oregon, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and of course, California. So I'm definitely looking forward to this topic, and of course, delighted to have this conversation. And of course, one important note, we definitely want to foster engagement here. So for those who have, if this is your first session, there is a Q&A tab that you'll see to the right of your screen. So if you have any questions throughout the panel, please feel free to add your question there. But yeah, so with that, I think we have all of our housekeeping rules out of the way, so we can jump right in. And I have our first question. What are success stories of incentive structures that have improved affordability of e-mobility? And so, of course, there are a few follow-up questions about that topic. So how should we define success in incentive and affordability programs? What does that look like? Is it uptake? The populations that are reached? What indicators are often left out? And also, what are the ingredients of success for these scenarios? So I'm sure our panelists may have some varying ideas coming at this from various angles. So with that topic to kick things off, would any of our panelists might like to take the first attempt at addressing that question?
Sure, I can start off. One thing that I think is extremely important when figuring out an incentive structure is when is that incentive being provided to the recipient? So there are really kind of two forms that people are approaching. That's post-purchase, often labeled as a rebate. So that's when the customer is fronting that money and then has to receive that incentive at a later date. The other option is to provide that incentive at the point of purchase, which is far more equitable and accessible to those looking to transition from gas to cleaner vehicle. They don't have to front that money. They don't have to wait for that check to come in the mail. And as we see these incentive programs continue to expand, there's a lot of participation. With that, sometimes the lag time from when you apply to when you actually receive those funds can be really long, exceeding 3 to 4 months. So with that, those that are limited on income or lower income really don't have that financial flexibility to put that money up front. They need that money immediately so that they can make that purchase. Mechanism that is extremely important when building out incentive structures.
Thank you, Vanessa. Suma, do you have anything to add to that, or any additional insight that you'd like to contribute?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak if that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, I guess I'd start out by saying I'm really excited to talk about this subject because I myself am a used plug-in hybrid owner. I have a Chevy Volt, which I love, and I was so happy to be able to procure a clean vehicle at a reasonable price. At the time I was contracting as a teacher at UC Irvine, and so it met my income requirements, and it's served me well. I bought it in 2017. It's running like a charm all these years later, and so I have a very personal interest, even though most of my career I've been focused on stationary sources. I'm really glad we're talking about this question of access. So when we think about incentives, it's obviously an important tool, right, to expand EV access and adoption, and increasing EV access to underserved communities in particular has substantial and immediate benefits from a social, economic, and health-related perspective. The potential to reach communities, low and moderate income communities, and apartment tenants, I think are all important pieces of the equation. So one of the programs that we have at the Air District is an EV incentive program called Clean Cars for All. It helps income qualified residents in frontline communities throughout the Bay Area turn in older, dirty vehicles and get up to a $9,500 incentive to purchase a new or used hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, battery electric vehicle, or a fuel cell electric vehicle. So I think similar to what Vanessa mentioned just now, the structure and the timing of incentives are really important. We found that customer service, assistance, program education, those are all key to successful program implementation, especially when you're trying to encourage residents to adopt, what could be perceived as new technologies. We found that it's important to think about maximizing incentives by things like stacking funding, and that stacking of funding is especially important when you're trying to help those with the highest need. As Vanessa mentioned, one of the recommendations of the Bay Area's EV acceleration plan is to prioritize point of sale incentives to make sure that it's incorporated in the sale price rather than forcing people to pay up front, which creates, in some cases, undue burden. And we have found that to be an effective way to structure the timing. Another structure or tool that's sometimes used are tax credits, but those can be of limited value to low-income residents because if you don't have a high enough tax liability to begin with, you can't really take advantage of a tax credit. One thing that we've also been thinking about is consumer protection measures, requiring checks for recalls, things like interest rate caps and the like. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you, Suma. And I think I might have a brief follow-up question to one of the recommendations that you include in your response. But of course, I want to make sure that all of our panelists have a chance to chime in. So, Tria?
Yeah, so I wrote down because I was like, let me make sure I don't say the same thing because y'all are so wise. Program design starts from the beginning. So the person, the team that is, given the funding, if it's coming from the state, if it's coming from the local government, they have an extreme responsibility to take into account how this program is going to impact the communities that it's supposed to be serving. So defining metrics to me were the communities that this program is supposed to serve included in the design of the program. There's a lot of successful programs in the state of California, Clean Cars for All, Bay Area, Sacramento, South Coast, coming soon, San Diego, and what's been the kind of foundation of all of the stop and replace programs, Valley Air's Clean Cars for All, have been extremely successful in meeting communities where they need to be met, which is within their community. CVAP, Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, which is the statewide version of Vivian Rawaji's program. The local financing assistance program is also an incredibly successful program because it centers the community member when trying to deliver the point of sale incentive for folks to purchase their vehicles. Defining success as an incentive program, I think now that we're in 2021, we've all been sitting in our homes, and I've gone from not seeing an EV commercial to having EV commercials pop up for me on YouTube. We no longer need incentive programs that serve the mass market. We really need to ensure that the infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better plan, all of this power that is coming to states, that they deliver incentive programs that are only for our communities that we're trying to meet and trying to serve. First come, first serve model, not going to work anymore. First come, first serve is kind of an antiquated way of delivering a social service, especially when we know that some people have a lot of access and some people don't have a lot of access, especially when everything is online. Thinking about our tribal communities that are at any time kind of at the whim of IOUs to turn off their power. We're talking about folks that may not have access to just electricity to get on their phone or get on their computer to complete applications. So all of these considerations have to be in the room, on the table when the program is designed. Incentive programs that define success through engaging the communities that they're supposed to serve, I think is an incredible metric to have. Like the priority metric is how many work groups, how many meetings, how many CBOs are connected to this program from the very beginning, from when we get the funding and we write down what the name of the program is even going to be. Coordination on requirements needs to be a metric of success. So are you creating a program that has requirements that are completely different than another statewide program? Why are we doing that? We need to be coordinating, especially if we're having goals to meet by 2030, 2035. Folks may not be able to purchase a vehicle that is most accessible to them. It really is our responsibility. It is the responsibility of those that are creating these programs to knock on some doors, to shoot out some emails and make sure that they're designing this program so things are easily stacked together and we can build the climate resiliency packages for people that are not just clean mobility and then maybe a battery and then maybe solar, but we're saying like this is an entire package for you as you go through these really rigorous processes to receive these benefits. And then the last one is kind of the checkbox, which is for our panel, like at least make sure that your incentive program allows for used EVs to be bought with your incentive. Just check that box. And I think most of the programs in California do that. So most of the programs allow for used EVs, and that's been extremely successful in allowing for access to some of the older models of EVs that are really affordable and meet people's needs in terms of their transportation distance and things like that. So starts with program design and ends with just at least make sure that the program allows for used EVs.
No, thank you. I love this. This is, thanks for that terrific insight on that question. And Taria, I think you've definitely offered something that's pretty insightful because I will admit that most of my experience has involved working primarily with entities that are not yet at the stage of California with integrating a used EV component. So as we continue to work in other markets that are less mature than the market in California, that as they look to sort of expand their offerings, I think this is extremely valuable, especially what you mentioned before about incorporating CBOs at the very beginning of the process and not just looping them in after the program has been codified or designed or rolled out. So I think that's something that's extremely helpful because I think that could, definitely eliminate some of the hurdles that I can imagine would present themselves if you don't engage, some of the stakeholders that are most familiar with some of the barriers to adoption to begin with. So I think that was very valuable. And I think kind of tying into your point, Asuma, since I come primarily from programs that are focused, even though there are more programs that we're working with outside of California that are gradually starting to integrate used EV components. You mentioned a couple of key things. Obviously, if you're working with a dealership point of sale program or a direct to consumer new program, it's one thing for the dealership to apply at the point of sale and wait 30 or 60 days or 90 days for payment, for an incentive that they directly issue by reducing the cost of the vehicle. And likewise, a lot of new car consumers, don't mind paying the full cost for what we call a post-consumer program, our post-purchase. The consumer purchases the vehicle and then follows up with an application to receive an incentive at a later date. So I do think expediency of payment, I think, is definitely key. So if we have any decision makers or those in the policy space, yeah, that's something to keep in mind. But I do have a quick follow-up question. Not just you, but I guess anyone on the panel, with regard to avoiding the barrier of some consumers who are in the used EV market, putting up the entire cost and being reimbursed at a later date, that might be prohibitive to even making the purchase to begin with. Do you have any thoughts on how program implementers should integrate that? So is it, for example, working with dealerships or used EV dealerships directly to issue the incentive the way some states currently organize their new EV incentive programs? Are pre-qualification, sort of like a voucher type program where a potential applicant would get pre-qualified for participation, for the incentive and later. So I just want to hear your thoughts on the best way to do that, because I do agree that treating the used EV market in a much, more diverse population than the new EV market is something that's critical. But I'd just be interested to know if you have any follow-up thoughts on that or any suggestions for how best to integrate that into programs.
I guess I can start with some market research we did with respect to car dealerships broadly and what we found as a result of some of those surveys. So in August of 2019, we contracted with the Center for Sustainable Energy to study vehicle market stakeholders in the Bay Area. For the purpose of understanding the barriers that might exist to EV adoption. And that study included car dealership focus groups. Interestingly enough, those dealerships reported that for used EVs, sales were driven primarily by the availability of lease returns and trade-ins. The study found that dealerships with a healthy used EV inventory had vehicles that were usually priced attractively, and those vehicles tended to sell pretty quickly. And so when dealerships were asked to share ideas on how to accelerate EV sales, they suggested increased customer rebates, to your point, greater investment in infrastructure, extending HOV lane access, and also providing dealerships with EV sales support.
Thank you. Thanks. That's extremely helpful. So hopefully that was beneficial. And as we're talking about dealerships, there is a question that I see in the Q&A that, I'll just wait until afterwards because I'd love to hear you all's thoughts on a question by Daphne Lee. So I think the next question before we open up the conversation that I would like to pose to the panel. What are your thoughts on the role of used EV markets in improving access to EVs and other forms of e-mobility?
I can go ahead and get that going. So used EV marks are really crucial to expanding accessibility to electrified transportation for lower income, moderate income, or those with, kind of financial constraints. So market, there's a lot more price variety. So with that, consumers are hopefully able to find a vehicle that's more fitting for their mobility needs as well as their financial capabilities. So used EVs, lower the barriers to making that switch over from gas to electric, which then allows those consumers, those new EV drivers, to benefit both from those financial savings from fuel and maintenance. So it really makes that switch more approachable, more accessible. It shows that, whoever was driving this vehicle before, they used it. It's a proof of concept that it's successful. It adds some confidence and assurance to making that vehicle switch.
Thanks, Vanessa. Any additional thoughts on that one?
The used EV market is critical to meet the goals that we have as a state and as a country. So I'm so glad that there's market research being done and totally reinforcing what Vanessa said. I think on top of the vehicle, there's an opportunity as well to really support used dealerships that are community based. So we have new car dealerships that are really going to be our critical stakeholders as well. But how do we leverage the used EV market and its accessibility to the communities that we are trying to serve as an opportunity, workforce development opportunity or a business development opportunity for us to support a local used car dealership that may be owned by a community member to build their used EV stock. And then we have the opportunity for more, how do I say, inclusive experiences at the car dealership. A lot of for Access Clean California, we have an outreach partner network, which is full of community-based organizations, community tops organizations, as well as like labor unions like SEIU. And they all give us similar feedback that the experience at the dealer is where things can kind of go wrong. Mm-hmm. And we'll get to Daphne's question as well, which is like, how do we address how do we address consumer protection when they get all the way through this process and are ready to purchase their vehicle? But there is an opportunity for us to really build kind of community hubs around used car dealerships that are independently owned, that allow for hopefully a better experience by community members, us to build another community, a community pillar in the form of allowing for a used car dealership that might be seen as a little bit seedy, but also an opportunity for folks to receive, maybe an experience that is more culturally relevant in the language that they speak, possibly more trusted because they're going to a place that they may pass every single day, and then realize that there was a used EV stock that they could participate in until they went through the program. So many of the programs in California have dealership networks, which is kind of a form of vetting dealerships and making sure that they're on board and they understand what this incentive program is, and then they'll possibly have folks come to them that have been approved for that incentive program. But I think on top of that, there's an opportunity, like I said, to really amplify independently owned used car dealerships that are businesses within the community, maybe the same person that you see at the grocery store that owns that car dealership, maybe the person you go to church with that owns that car dealership. How do we amplify those opportunities versus just relying on new car dealerships as well? And we know a lot of community members that we serve, at least, they may never have purchased a vehicle before. So it could be an experience that they're completely unfamiliar with and want to make sure that that's a supportive, inclusive, and fun process for them. This is a new purchase. This isn't just like, I think as government programs, state government programs and local government programs, we sometimes forget that we're asking people to do something for us. We're asking them to help us meet these goals. So the experience should be fun. It should be, relevant, culturally relevant, and linguistically relevant in their language. So they're excited to participate in this new future that we're coming to, which is electrified and more sustainable and more healthy for them as a community.
Yeah, and if I may pick up on a couple of those themes, I guess I would just add, as Tria mentioned, we have very ambitious climate goals here in California, which include 1.5 million EVs by 2030 and 90% EVs by 2050. So, as she mentioned, we need EVs to be become a bigger share of the market. Apart from the obvious fact that the used EV market allows drivers with lower income folks to gain access, there's also this question of pollution, right? Cleaner vehicles mean better air quality in communities that likely need it the most. And apart from the pollution benefits in EJ communities from cleaner vehicles, there's also the money saved on fuel and maintenance costs, ongoing costs associated with cars. That's another piece of the puzzle, and that's no small thing as we watch fuel prices increase dramatically, right? I think recently, and just this week, just a gallon of gas reached $4.68, and so it's another thing to think about.
No, thank you all, for this really comprehensive response to that question that I hope the attendees will find useful. So I think before we are getting a few questions here tied into some of the topics that we've already discussed, but before we do that, a final question I'd like to turn to before sharing some of the audience questions would be if anyone has any thoughts on how the pandemic and chip shortages will affect or have affected EV prices. Or in particular, given this topic, EV or used EV prices.
Since I suggested the question, maybe I can start. I think we've observed some supply chain issues, chip shortages, or logistics barriers that have been hampering the new vehicle market. We're seeing, I think, taking up a theme that was raised earlier, new EVs seem to be having higher dealership markups, sometimes as much as 5,000 to 10,000 above the MSRP. And that in turn has a trickle-down effect, which makes used vehicle prices also skyrocket. We're seeing used EVs priced $3,000 to $4,000 more than they were prior to the pandemic. Its supply has been also affected, and vehicles are thus a little harder to find. Hopefully that'll change with time.
Yeah, I can add on to that a little bit. So in addition to that chip shortage, there's also some semiconductor shortages, which impacts the new vehicle market, and then that trickles down into, my apologies, the used vehicle market as well. With that, we've seen some pretty large inventory drops on average across the US, about 20%. Looking at California, that's almost about 40. So it's really impacted what's actually on the lot. So when people are trying to go make that purchase, it can be not motivating to see a lot of variety out there in terms of price and also models. So with that, the prices are higher, options are limited. So with that patience, hopefully towards the beginning of 2022, we'll see some improvements. I'm in the market to get a vehicle, so I'm really hoping by then we see some changes.
Yeah.
No, thanks, Vanessa. Tari, do you have anything to add to that question?
No, they covered it. Pipeline inventory gone for a lot of products, not just including vehicles. So we're going through it, but hopefully it gets better.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that is a perfect segue into some of the questions that we have here. So given sort of what you mentioned before about what we're seeing with markups, we actually received a question that I would like to pose to the panel that you've probably already seen if you've had a chance to scroll over. Are there policies addressing dealer markups on top of the MSRP for EVs? Some dealers are marking up by $10,000, which reduces the benefits of incentives. That's a great question. So I'll turn it over to the panel.
I think, as I mentioned, the California's approach to having dealership networks is one way that doesn't rely on legislation to do something and regulation to be made. So having incentive programs vet and create an approved dealership list is one way. Another way that we've heard, and I want to say it's from the local financing assistance program, Drive Clean Assistance Program in the Bay Area. They have worked with community-based organizations, and probably other incentive programs have done this as well, but doing car buy days together. So going as a group of people that have all been approved for an incentive, and then going to a dealership together, maybe with a checklist for themselves, so they know maybe not to tell the dealer that you have an incentive before you get to the paperwork side of things, or going as a group and having somewhat of a kind of facilitator of the transaction to allow for kind of that consumer protection. I think it's hard to put the responsibility on dealerships to protect consumers. They're car dealerships. They're trying to make a profit in an industry that it's really hard to make a profit in. So to continuously ask dealerships to be better, I think is somewhat wasting time when we can equip consumers, equip incentive programs, work with more locally based independent used car dealerships that you can build a trusting relationship with, and with your community members to ensure that they're getting the vehicle that they need at the price point that they need it. You know, and talking to an independent car dealership, I don't remember the one in Sacramento, but they have continuously kept a really good used EV stock. Who knows what's going on now with all of the supply chain issues, but they continuously are receiving incentive applicants, approved applicants to purchase a vehicle. So by building that trusting relationship with a smaller used EV lot, and saying like, we're going to ensure that you have customers coming through that are prepared to purchase a car. They're not just coming to look, they're prepared to purchase an EV off your lot. That is going to be a successful model. It's a smaller model. It's going to be, you know, a small distributed model that's not as easy as, you know, working with larger car dealership networks, but it's one that is going to ensure that our community members are protected when they go purchase that vehicle.
Thanks, Taria. Were there any additional thoughts on that one? I thought that was a great question. Yeah, and I'll say that I think this is like great insight, because I know that for a lot of the new EV programs, the rebates are actually, depending on the state of the market of the utility, it's based on criteria like, you know, miles per, the number of miles up to a certain point, and then beyond a certain MSRP. The incentives taper off, or they'll have a list of pre-qualified of eligible vehicles with an assigned rebate level based on the all-electric miles of that vehicle. But those are for new cars. Used cars, it's a little trickier, because typically the rebates are going to be larger. You know, for a large, you know, new EV program, you could have the lowest tier of incentives at, let's say, $500 for a vehicle over $55,000, regardless of mile range, because, you know, there's some research that may suggest that those customers may not be as rebate essential, you know, compared to others, because if you're paying $70,000 for a vehicle, are there many states that eliminate vehicles over a certain price? So that helps to a certain extent curtail, you know, any pricing to their levels of rebates, since it is tied directly to the vehicle. But with used, you typically have larger incentives than you would for a new car vehicle, because obviously you're trying to increase, you know, the delta between what they would typically pay for a used car and what they would pay after incentive. So usually those are large blanket incentives that are not necessarily, they might be broken out by technology, you know, in other words, incentivizing a battery electric vehicle at a higher level than a plug-in electric vehicle, but usually you don't see this sort of a granular tier structures that curtail that. So I really appreciate the panel's insight into that tough question. And speaking of, another question I'd like to pose to the panel that appears to be pretty popular. So, and we actually had two questions that are pretty similar related to the same topic. So there are a few participants that wanted to know if the panel could discuss the implications of battery replacement cost. Are there any programs addressing battery replacement costs, which can be around double rebate or incentive amounts?
So battery replacement is hard because, I think from my seat, if we're going to require people to go through really excessive and extensive processes to prove that they need help to purchase a piece of transportation, and that transportation is electrified and supporting climate goals, they should be receiving a product that is substantial and allows them to drive for a while. So I get conflicted when I hear this question, because I'm like, well, why do we need to replace batteries for people? Shouldn't they be receiving a vehicle that has an extensive battery life? So conflicted. But there is a program. I don't know if it's launched just yet. It's from California Air Resources Board, and it's probably taking a while to launch because it's a really hard question. How do you build requirements around what battery can be replaced and what battery can't be replaced? Who's going to replace that battery? And what mechanics are prepared and have the ability to replace a battery with a different battery? Where is that new battery going to come from? If we are building a market just to have EVs on lots, where are the spare batteries to then replace old batteries? So there's a lot of questions. I think that battery replacement is an important incentive program. I don't know how relevant the incentive program is right now. I think there's kind of a double-edged sword. It's like we want to have used EVs, we want to have EVs accessible for our communities, especially the ones that have financial constraints. So should we be offering them a market where their batteries may not last as long? But I think the other side of that sword is, can't we just increase incentive amounts and allow for folks to buy EVs that have batteries that are going to last a while? So that's my answer to that question. And it reinforces the idea of, we need to stop having incentives for the mass market. If you can afford a $50,000 car, if you can afford a $30,000 vehicle, do you need support in purchasing an electric vehicle? We're talking about, the communities that Access Clean California is trying to serve are folks that, maybe living in a multi-generational household, maybe living in a rural part of California, may be making less than $20,000 a year in a household of 6. We're trying to build accessibility for folks that have the greatest barriers to access. So the incentive programs that are coming out, and from my seat, should be designed for folks that have the greatest barriers to access. If we continuously create incentive programs that are trying to meet mid-market, people like me, millennials, that are on the internet a lot, that know what's going on, that are going to be interested in an electric vehicle because it makes sense, we're going to continuously have this large part of the market, our lower income, our BIPOC communities, our rural tribal communities, that are going to be left behind. So just reinforcing the idea that incentive programs should be designed for folks that have the greatest barriers to access these programs, and ensuring that the incentive amount matches the technology, the price of the technology they need to receive a long-lasting product, instead of thinking about, somewhat of a kind of competitive priority of low cost, only kind of reinforces this idea of like purchasing things that aren't of quality. Do we want folks to receive an under quality vehicle, especially transportation? I can't really agree with that. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I guess picking up on that a little bit, although I'm pleased to report that, our Clean Cars for All program has reached, I guess, 1,800 folks, and 40% of those folks purchased used vehicles under that program, which is, I think, good. We still have some work to do on reaching Black and Latinx communities in particular. And this question about battery life is a question that relates to cost. And the value you're getting when you buy a used vehicle. It also relates to this life cycle pollution issue, right? Where do the batteries go? How do we extend the life? How do we create quality batteries that have an extended life? So, they're not, they don't end up in other EJ communities, and so there's also this environmental justice and pollution element to this question about battery life. And I don't have any elegant solution, but I think it's an important question, a critical question to ask.
Thank you. Vanessa, do you have anything to add to that question?
Sure. Definitely echo both of the sentiments expressed by Taria and Suma. I think another thing, at least from my direct experience when I was supporting the Clean Cars for All program, is really speaking to, just being really transparent with those accessing this program. Taria was noting. And then in addition to that, the savings that EVs do bring, I try to illuminate that, those fuel and maintenance savings, those then could potentially be shifted towards battery replacement if that need be. Also, I think another important element to illuminate is EVs do have warranties per X amount of miles per year. So at least that does add some assurance when you are making that switch over to know that your vehicle is protected.
No, thank you. Yeah, thank you. That was a tough one, but I think the panel did an excellent job responding to that question. Another we have here, and just a quick reminder for those of you who are posting questions in the chat, please post those in the Q&A tab and not the chat. So just a quick reminder, because hopefully we'll have a chance to get to at least a few more of those. So another question. So LEV-ZEV rules are key policies for expanding model availability for new cars. There are analogous policies that encourage growth in the used market.
I'm not really sure how to answer that question. It seems like, the same key policies for new models are going to impact and allow for, as Suma named in that in the research that they've done, having more people purchasing or leasing new vehicles gives more kind of builds the used EV market. So it's kind of like, hopefully these policies are supporting both markets.
Right, yeah, and I think that would be sort of my natural inclination to respond to that, is that since we're talking about secondary markets here, it's the policies that expand sort of like the new EV market will eventually transfer as those cars, are eventually enter the used car market. All right, so another question that we have here. There are many ways to structure a used EV incentive. Do you have preferences on MSRP/transaction cap, income limits, which I understand can make it hard to do point of sale incentives, max age? So that's quite a bit there. So I know that's a big question. And of course, we only have 11 minutes, but I'm pretty sure Alyssa would appreciate, as well as others who are interested in that topic would appreciate the panel's insights into that question, which I know we could probably have an entire panel session just on, incentive design. So.
Yeah, I guess I can speak a little bit to that. As Taria mentioned, Clean Cars for All does include incentives for used vehicles, and 40% of the rebates went to used vehicles, which is good. Obviously, hoping to expand the program That being said, we do have a tiered structure. So that's based on income. So the lower the income, the higher the rebate, to try to address some of these equity issues. So that's one structural thing that we've implemented.
Great. No, thanks, Vanessa. I think that's great. And of course, I definitely, if anyone else wants to chime in, let me know. But of course, I just want to direct you all. There's quite a bit of literature published just on incentive structures to begin with. Some performed by colleagues, other universities. So I'm pretty sure that I'd be happy personally to direct you to any resources about incentive tier design, because that's a big question, especially as more states and utilities are entering the used EV incentive space, because that's where we probably see, as someone pointed out, where we probably need to focus most of our effort at this point. But of course, I want to make sure that if anyone else wants to contribute to that topic, or if you have any thoughts on those preferences, income limits or MSRP caps, if any.
Program design, as I keep harping on, should include the community. So if we're thinking about an income limit, and this is an incentive for a rural part of the state or specifically for tribal communities, income limit may not be the best kind of lever, because as we know that rural parts of the state have lower incomes, and some tribal, especially some rural tribes have lack of access to workforce development opportunities. So in thinking about the design of a program, especially for a specific part of your community or your state, an incentive structure, an incentive design that works in rural California may not work in a coastal city like Oakland and San Francisco. Having a limit on the types of electric vehicles, so limiting hybrids and maybe saying like hybrids, conventional hybrids and plug-in hybrids are going to have a lower incentive amount. That can be really impactful in the rural part of the state where we know that charging infrastructure is limited and then everything is very far from each other. Just thinking about like Northern California is massive. Between the two like highways in Northern California, it could be like a 6-hour trip. It takes you like 12 hours to get from the top of the state to the bottom of the state. So thinking about how do you get funding for your program, the first step should be who else should be in the room with us, especially who from the community should be in the room for us, with us. And that can be community-based organizations or community tops organizations, or an organization you may not even think about, like your school district could be in the room and really support you in designing this program. So leveraging your community, the community that the incentive program is going to serve, is an excellent way of designing a program to be the most impactful. I don't have the answers. I now live in Salt Lake City. And Salt Lake City has a really different car market here. Our gas is still less than $3.50 a gallon. There isn't a really big incentive to purchase an electric vehicle, though I see quite a few Teslas and Leafs on the road. So the incentive program for Utah is going to be much different than an incentive program in California. And Utah is in itself a very diverse state in terms of how big it is and how many different cities there are. So I can't harp on enough. There is an extreme amount of wisdom and wealth. And as it was said in some of the beginning plenaries, those that are closest to the problem are definitely closest to the solution, because they're thinking about it every single day when they have to pay over $4.50 a gallon to get their kids to school, to get to work, to drive from the Central Valley, to drive for a TNC in San Francisco. So let's not forget there's an unlimited amount of wealth of knowledge from the people that are experiencing these barriers every day.
And I'll just expand on Taria's comment quickly, because I know we're getting close to time. So with that, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You really do need community input from the start. A lot of organizations are really latching on to the diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, it's an afterthought. And with that, you're not getting those equity outcomes that you really need to have that impact in that community. So having listening sessions, surveys, focus groups where you're really having direct connections to community members is how you can really build out a program where you see those equity outcomes materialize, where you see accessibility expand. Really just noting what Taria mentioned, you really need to have those conversations from the start so that those programs are really intentionally designed for those communities.
Yeah. And just to add on that real quick, our folks have found that data collection is a critical piece of the puzzle. And, this participatory research kind of, environment. And so that being said, segmenting data collection has also been critical so that we're not overburdening the application process. And so, frequent and targeted data collection is key. We found through the process of collecting that data and establishing metrics for success that even though we're reaching some of the lowest income populations in the Bay Area, like I mentioned earlier, we're not doing as great a job at reaching Black and Latinx communities. So the data is really critical in determining that and figuring out how to do better in that area.
Thank you all for that. So we only have 3 minutes left, but I want to make sure that maybe if we can get quick answers at least to what was the most popular question, or one of the most popular questions we received. Should EV incentives continue to be offered for hybrids, or should we move towards PHEVs, BEVs with higher emissions reductions? Thoughts on balancing equitable access with aggressive climate goals? I knew that was going to come up. I know we only have a couple of minutes, but if maybe each of you could kind of go and give like a quick elevator pitch or summation of what you think about that one before we take it home.
I think, when you're talking about the used market in particular, I think there's the reality probably of the spread. And so that's something to consider. And, thinking about, fully electric vehicles without thinking about infrastructure, I think, can be a little bit of a mismatch.
Vanessa, Taria, any quick thoughts on that before we wrap up? Yeah.
Sure, I'll be brief on this. So I echo Suma's points. I think one thing is if programs are going to not include hybrids, it's really important to think about the infrastructure accessibility as well. So like Clean Cars for All, they provide financial support to public charging stations, as well as incentives to install. So making sure it's a more holistic approach, because if you're going to encourage someone into a specific type of technology, they really need to have the infrastructure to support that change.
Okay, thanks. Taria, take us out.
It's hard to balance, right? And going back to just my previous comment, hybrids can be critical for rural parts of the state where infrastructure isn't being built because it's not an optimal market to build charging infrastructure yet. So it's a hard question. We do have aggressive climate goals, and we are at an e-mobility conference. So hopefully, if hybrids are no longer an option and it's pushing for plug-in EVs as well as battery electric vehicles, there's electric bikes, there's scooters. Hopefully we're getting electrified buses in communities that deserve electrified buses first. Everyone deserves electrified buses, but hopefully we see in this transitionary period where we're trying to just meet emissions goals. Our individual transportation is emitting the most pollution. Let's figure out how we meet that. But also in this transitionary period, we see so many other forms of mobility also being electrified. And I think that, in 10 years, things are going to look a lot different. Our built environment is going to look a lot different to support transportation and the movement of people in much more efficient and inclusive ways. So right now, hard decisions. In 10 years, hopefully not as hard decisions, because we're not just focused on cars to get from point A to point B.
Okay. And with that, thank you so much. You're right. Hard question, many hard questions, but Well, with that, I want to thank you all for joining us for Looking Beyond the MSRP. I hope this was an informative panel. If you have any additional questions or thoughts, please feel free to connect with us. And I want to thank all of our panelists for their valuable insight. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you all so
Thank
much.
you.
Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Marcus.
Yeah,
Thank you, Marcus.
thank you.
Should we just hop off?
I think so.
Okay. See you later. Thank you.
See you later.